Commander Arya Voss clung tightly to her ship's controls, alarms blaring as the craft spiraled through the alien planet's atmosphere. Smoke filled the cockpit, sparks dancing along the shattered panels. Every instinct screamed at her to eject, but the hostile terrain below left her no choice but to crash land. With a final wrench of the joystick, she aimed for a clearing amid the dense, glowing jungle and braced for impact. The ship slammed into the ground, metal shrieking as it skidded to a halt, throwing Arya hard against her harness. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by her ragged breathing. She unlatched her restraints and staggered out of the wreckage, taking in her surroundings. Towering trees with bioluminescent leaves bathed the area in eerie light, their colors shifting with every slight breeze. This world was alive, dangerous, and utterly foreign. Arya didn't have long to admire the scenery. A low growl came from the shadows. She whirled around, drawing her sidearm, but before she could identify the source, a massive figure leapt from the underbrush, claws gleaming in the pale light. Arya rolled to the side as the creature landed where she had stood, the ground quaking beneath its weight. The attacker was feline in form, with sleek fur that rippled like liquid shadow. It stood upright, towering over her, its muscular frame exuding raw power. Its golden eyes narrowed, and a predatory smirk curled its lips. More figures emerged from the trees, circling her with feline grace. Arya's heart pounded, but she wasn't a soldier for nothing. Raising her weapon, she fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed through the jungle, causing the creatures to pause. One of them, evidently the leader, barked something in a guttural language and stepped forward. Outsider, it growled, its voice deep and resonant. You trespass on Tar land. Arya didn't lower her weapon. I didn't have much of a choice, she shot back, her voice steady despite the tension coiling in her chest. My ship was hit by some kind of energy storm. I'm stranded. The leader snorted, clearly unimpressed. Stranded or not, you are weak. You will not survive here. Arya's eyes narrowed. Try me. The challenge was met with a flash of teeth, the leader's smirk widening. He gestured, and one of the warriors lunged at her. Arya anticipated the move, sidestepping and delivering a swift, precise strike to its side. The creature stumbled, and she followed up with a knee to its jaw, sending it sprawling. The circle of warriors erupted in snarls, but the leader raised a hand, silencing them. His expression was no longer amused, it was calculating. Perhaps not as weak as you appear, he admitted, his tone begrudging. But strength alone is not enough. Good thing I've got more than that, Arya replied, her stance unyielding. The leader stepped closer, his golden eyes locked on hers. I am Yerrick, alpha of this tribe. You will come with me. Arya's grip on her weapon tightened. Why should I trust you? You have no choice, Yerrick said simply. The jungle will devour you if you remain alone. And we have need of your kind. Though every instinct screamed against it, Arya knew he was right. Her survival depended on understanding this world, and for now, Yerrick was her best chance. She nodded slowly, holstering her weapon. Lead the way. Yerrick signaled to his warriors, and they formed a loose escort around Arya as they began their journey through the jungle. The path was treacherous, the dense vegetation concealing steep drops and venomous creatures. Yerrick moved with ease, his every step purposeful, while Arya had to stay alert, her military training the only thing keeping her from falling behind. As they walked, Arya couldn't help but notice the way Jarek's presence dominated the group. His movements were fluid, almost mesmerizing, and his voice carried an authority that commanded immediate obedience. He was different from any creature she'd encountered, both in form and demeanor. After what felt like hours, they arrived at the Tar settlement, a sprawling village built into the trees, with rope bridges and wooden platforms connecting the various levels. The glowing flora illuminated the settlement in hues of blue and green, creating an otherworldly beauty. The villagers stopped their tasks to stare at Arya, their expressions ranging from curiosity to open hostility. Yerrick ignored them, leading her to a central platform where a council of elders awaited. He exchanged brief words with them in their native tongue before turning to Arya. "You will remain here under my protection," Yarrick declared. "But know this: any sign of betrayal, and you will be dealt with." Arya crossed her arms, meeting his gaze without flinching. Understood. The tension in the air was palpable, but Yarrick seemed satisfied. He dismissed the council and gestured for Arya to follow him to a nearby shelter. Inside, the space was surprisingly warm and inviting, with woven mats and furs covering the floor. "You'll rest here," Yarrick said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We have much to discuss, but that can wait until dawn." Arya nodded, though her mind was already racing. The Tar were unlike any species she'd encountered, and their leader was a puzzle she intended to solve. As Yarrick turned to leave, she called out, "Why did you bring me here? What is it you need from me?" Yarrick paused at the doorway, his golden eyes flickering with something unreadable. "You will see soon enough," he said softly, his voice almost a growl. Then he was gone, leaving Arya alone with her thoughts and the quiet hum of the jungle outside. Despite her exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. The events of the day played over in her mind: the crash, the fight, Jarek's intense gaze. She was a stranger in a dangerous land, but she wasn't about to back down. Whatever challenge lay ahead, she would face it head on. And she had a feeling Yarrick would be at the center of it all. The dawn broke over the Tar settlement, casting the jungle in a warm, golden light. Arya stood at the edge of the platform, her eyes scanning the village below. The night had offered little rest, her mind too preoccupied with questions and the weight of her precarious situation. Now, the waking world was alive with the sounds of Tar life: warriors sparring, children playing, and hunters preparing for the day's tasks. She didn't have long to reflect before Yarrick approached, his presence as commanding as ever. His broad frame moved with a quiet confidence, his golden eyes sharp and assessing. He stopped a few paces away, arms crossed. "You've seen our home," he said, his tone even. "What do you think?" Arya turned to face him, meeting his gaze head on. "Efficient, resilient, but you're fighting a losing battle, aren't you?" Jarek's jaw tightened. "We survive. That is all that matters." "For now," Arya replied. "But if this Void Titan is as dangerous as you say, survival won't be enough." Yarrick regarded her in silence, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Follow me," he said finally, turning and leading her down a series of wooden staircases to the village's central gathering area. The Tar warriors stopped their training to watch her pass, their expressions ranging from wary to outright hostile. Arya kept her head high, refusing to let their disdain rattle her. She'd faced worse in her time, and she wasn't about to let a tribe of skeptics intimidate her. Yarrick led her to a wide, open space where a group of elders waited, their fur streaked with silver, their eyes keen and calculating. "This human," Yarrick began, his voice carrying authority, "has skills that may aid us in our fight. She is not to be underestimated." One of the elders, an older male with deep scars across his face, stepped forward. "She is an outsider," he said, his voice heavy with skepticism. "Her kind brings only destruction. Why should we trust her?" Arya stepped forward, her tone firm. "I didn't ask for your trust," she said. "I'm here because I want to survive, just like you. If working together means stopping this Void Titan, then that's what we'll do. But if you'd rather let pride get in the way, I'll find another way." The elder's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Yarrick raised a hand. "Enough. She has proven her strength in combat. Now, she must prove her worth in strategy." Yarrick turned to Arya, his expression unreadable. "Our scouts report a Void Titan outpost near the western ridge. We will strike it tonight. You will lead." Arya blinked, surprised by the sudden responsibility. But she nodded, her military training kicking in. "I'll need to see the terrain and your fighter's capabilities," she said. "If we're going to do this, we do it right." Yarrick inclined his head. "Then you have the day to prepare. Do not waste it." Arya spent the next several hours observing the Tar warriors in action. Their combat style was raw and brutal, relying on sheer strength and speed. It was effective in close quarters, but left them vulnerable to coordinated attacks. She quickly formulated a plan, integrating their strengths with the tactical precision her training had taught her. As the sun began to set, she gathered the warriors for a briefing. Yerrick stood beside her, his silent presence lending weight to her words. "We'll divide into 3 teams," Arya explained, using a crude map scratched into the dirt. "Team 1 will create a diversion here, drawing their forces out. Team 2 will flank from the east, cutting off their retreat. Team 3, led by Yerrick and me, will hit their core defenses. Speed and precision are key. Any questions?" The warriors exchanged skeptical glances, but none voiced their doubts. Jarrick's approval was enough to silence any dissent. Night fell quickly, and the jungle came alive with the sounds of nocturnal predators. The tar moved through the shadows like ghosts, their dark fur blending seamlessly with the foliage. Arya led her team with quiet confidence, her senses heightened by the adrenaline coursing through her veins. When they reached the outpost, the battle unfolded exactly as she'd planned. The diversion team drew the Void Titans' forces into a chaotic melee, while the flanking team cut them down from behind. Arya and Yerrick led the charge into the heart of the outpost, their combined strength and strategy proving unstoppable. Arya found herself fighting back to back with Yerrick, their movements synchronized in a deadly dance. His claws tore through the enemy with brutal efficiency, while she covered him with precise, calculated strikes. For a moment, she felt an almost primal connection with him, their mutual respect and reliance on each other driving them forward. As the last of the enemy fell, the outpost fell silent. The tar let out a triumphant roar, their victory echoing through the jungle. But Arya's focus remained on Yerrick, who stood beside her, his chest rising and falling with exertion. "You fought well," Yerrick said, his voice low and rough. "So did you," Arya replied, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer than necessary. They returned to the village victorious, the warriors' attitudes toward Arya beginning to shift. While many still regarded her with caution, there was a new undercurrent of respect. Even the elders seemed less hostile, though their approval was far from given. As the village settled in for the night, Yerrick approached Arya outside her shelter. The glow of the jungle illuminated his features, casting shadows across his sharp jawline. "You've earned their respect," he said quietly, "but trust is harder to come by." Arya crossed her arms, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not here to win a popularity contest. I'm here to help you survive." Yerrick stepped closer, his gaze intense. "You've done more than that," he murmured, his voice taking on a softer, more intimate tone. "You've proven you belong." For a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink, the tension crackling like electricity. Arya's breath caught as Yerrick raised a hand, his fingers brushing lightly against her arm. The touch was brief, but it left a trail of warmth in its wake. "Rest now," Yerrick said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The real battle is yet to come." With that, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Arya alone with her thoughts and the lingering sensation of his touch. The jungle was quiet in the early dawn, the stillness broken only by the rustle of leaves and distant calls of unseen creatures. Arya stood on the edge of the training grounds, watching as the Tar warriors gathered in small groups, their movements fluid and precise. After their recent victory, a new sense of purpose had taken hold of the tribe. Even the skeptical elders seemed less critical, their gazes more contemplative than disapproving. Yerrick approached her from the shadows, his presence unmistakable even before she turned to face him. His golden eyes caught the morning light, and his expression was as unreadable as ever. "You've made progress," he said, his voice low but carrying an undercurrent of approval. "The warriors listen to you now." "They listen because they know what's at stake," Arya replied, crossing her arms. "And because they've seen that I can help them survive." Yerrick stepped closer, his gaze lingering on her. "Survival isn't enough. Not anymore." Before she could respond, a commotion broke out on the far side of the training grounds. A young warrior stumbled into view, clutching a deep gash on his arm. His fur was matted with blood, and his eyes were wide with panic. "They're coming," he gasped. "The Void Scouts. They found us." The atmosphere shifted instantly. Warriors grabbed their weapons, their movements sharp and practiced. Jarek's expression hardened as he turned to Arya. "We'll meet them at the northern ridge," he said. "You'll lead the defense." Arya nodded, already calculating their approach. She followed Yarok as he barked orders to the warriors, organizing them into units. Within minutes, the Tar were ready, their eyes gleaming with a fierce determination. The journey to the northern ridge was tense, every shadow and rustling leaf a potential threat. When they reached the high ground, Arya quickly assessed the terrain. The ridge provided a natural choke point, but the dense jungle below offered ample cover for the enemy. "Set up an ambush here," she instructed, pointing to a cluster of rocks. "We'll force them into the open and take them down before they can retreat." Yarok nodded, his trust in her judgment evident. Together, they positioned the warriors and waited. The air grew thick with anticipation, the silence stretching taut. When the Void Scouts finally emerged, their appearance was as unsettling as Arya remembered. Their forms were twisted, almost humanoid, but with features that seemed to shift and blur in the dim light. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural red hue, and the weapons they carried pulsed with a dark energy. Arya gave the signal, and the Tar sprang into action. The ambush was swift and brutal, the warriors descending upon the scouts with claws and blades. Arya moved through the chaos with precision, her every strike calculated to exploit the enemy's weaknesses. Beside her, Yarok fought with a ferocity that was almost mesmerizing. His movements were a blend of raw power and practiced skill, his claws slicing through the void creatures with ease. At one point, he caught her gaze, and for a brief moment, the intensity of his focus made her breath hitch. The battle was over quickly, the last of the scouts falling beneath Jarek's claws. The Tar let out triumphant roars, their victory echoing through the jungle. But Arya's relief was short-lived. She knew this was only the beginning. As the warriors tended to their wounded, Yarok pulled Arya aside. His expression was serious, his tone low. "The scouts were only a warning," he said. "The real threat is coming, and we're running out of time." Arya nodded, her mind already racing with plans. "We need to prepare the village for a full-scale attack. Fortify the defenses, set traps, and ensure everyone knows their role." Yarok placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch firm yet grounding. "You've proven yourself, Arya. The tribe will follow you." There was a weight to his words that went beyond the immediate danger. Arya met his gaze, her own resolve mirrored in his eyes. "We'll face it together." They returned to the village, where preparations began in earnest. Arya worked alongside the warriors, demonstrating techniques and refining their strategy. Despite the tension, there was a growing sense of unity, the tribe rallying around their shared goal. As night fell, the village settled into a tense quiet. Arya found herself standing by the central fire, her thoughts heavy. Yarok approached, his presence as steadying as ever. "You should rest," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Tomorrow will test us all." Arya shook her head. "I can't rest. Not yet." Yarok stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. "You carry the weight of this fight on your shoulders, but you don't have to bear it alone." For a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink. Jarek's hand brushed against hers, his touch warm and grounding. Arya felt her pulse quicken, the tension between them crackling like the fire at their feet. Without thinking, she leaned in, and Yarok met her halfway. Their lips brushed, the kiss tentative at first, but quickly deepening. It was a moment of connection, a brief reprieve from the looming threat. When they finally pulled apart, Jarek's gaze was intense, his voice a low rumble. "Whatever comes tomorrow, we face it together." Arya nodded, her resolve strengthened. Together. The quiet of the moment didn't last long. A distant, unnatural howl echoed through the jungle, sending a shiver down Arya's spine. The Void Titan's forces were on the move. Jarek's expression hardened. "It begins." The distant howl of the void creatures reverberated through the jungle, cutting through the night like a blade. The Tar warriors gathered around the central fire, their expressions grim but resolute. The time for preparation was over. Now it was time to face the threat head on. Arya stood beside Yeruk, her mind racing as she went over their battle plan one last time. The village was fortified as best as they could manage, with traps set along the perimeter and defensive positions established. Every warrior knew their role, and even the non-combatants had been armed with makeshift weapons in case the battle reached the heart of the settlement. Jarek's hand brushed against her arm, drawing her attention. His golden eyes were steady, a silent reassurance in the face of the coming storm. "We're ready," he said quietly. Arya nodded, though the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on her. "We'll hold the line," she said, her voice firm. "No matter what." As the first wave of void creatures broke through the jungle, the battle erupted with terrifying intensity. The creatures were grotesque, their forms shifting and writhing as if they were made of shadow and flame. They charged at the village's defenses with relentless ferocity, their eerie red eyes glowing in the darkness. Arya fought alongside the Tar warriors, her movements precise and deadly. She had traded her human weapon for a tar blade, its edge gleaming with a faint, otherworldly light. The weapon felt right in her hands, a perfect blend of strength and speed. Yeruk was a whirlwind of claws and fury, his roars cutting through the cacophony of battle. He fought with a primal intensity, his every strike landing with devastating force. The warriors rallied around him, their confidence bolstered by his unyielding presence. The traps Arya had devised proved effective, slowing the void creature's advance and creating opportunities for the Tar to strike. Explosive devices rigged from salvaged ship parts detonated in bursts of light and sound, disorienting the enemy and turning the tide in the Tar's favor. But the void forces were unrelenting. For every creature they felled, more seemed to take its place. Arya's muscles burned with exertion, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she refused to falter. This was what she had trained for, and she would not let these creatures destroy the tribe she had come to care for. As the battle raged on, Arya noticed a shift in the enemy's tactics. The void creatures began to focus their attacks on specific points in the defenses, as if guided by a sinister intelligence. She realized with a sinking feeling that the void titan itself was directing the assault, its will driving the creatures toward a singular purpose. "They're trying to break through the eastern wall," she shouted to Yeruk, who immediately rallied a group of warriors to reinforce the position. Together, they fought their way to the eastern perimeter, where the battle was at its fiercest. The void creatures had managed to breach the outer defenses, and the fighting had devolved into brutal close-quarters combat. Arya's blade sang as she cut through the enemy, her movements a blur of calculated efficiency. Beside her, Yeruk was a force of nature, his powerful strikes leaving devastation in their wake. Despite their efforts, the tide of battle continued to shift dangerously. Amid the chaos, a piercing scream drew Arya's attention. She turned to see one of the young warriors, barely more than a teenager, cornered by a towering void beast. Without hesitation, Arya charged toward them, her blade cutting through the creature's flank in a spray of dark ichor. The young warrior stared at her in shock, his wide eyes reflecting both fear and awe. "Stay close to the others," Arya said firmly, helping him to his feet. "We need every fighter on the line." The battle wore on, the night stretching endlessly as the void forces pressed their attack. Despite the Tara's fierce resistance, the strain began to show. Warriors fell, their blood mingling with the dark ichor of the enemy. Desperation crept into the ranks, but Arya and Yeruk continued to fight, their resolve unshaken. In a brief lull, Yeruk pulled Arya aside, his breath heavy. "We can't hold this position forever," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We need to find a way to turn the tide." Arya's mind raced, searching for a solution. Then it struck her. "The Void Titan," she said, her eyes narrowing. "It's controlling them. If we can sever its connection, we might have a chance." Yeruk nodded, his expression grim. "Then we'll find it. Together." They gathered a small group of the most skilled warriors and prepared to strike out into the jungle. The battle continued to rage behind them, but Arya knew this was their only chance to end the onslaught. If they could reach the Void Titan and disrupt its control, they could save the village. The journey was perilous, every step fraught with danger as they navigated the dense jungle. The Void creatures seemed to sense their intent, attacking with increased ferocity. Arya and Yarick fought side by side, their bond strengthened by the shared struggle. When they finally reached the clearing where the Void Titan awaited, Arya's breath caught in her throat. The creature was massive, its form an amalgamation of shadow and flame, with glowing red eyes that burned with malevolent intelligence. It radiated an aura of pure darkness, its presence a palpable weight in the air. Yarick growled low, his muscles tensing as he prepared to charge. Arya placed a hand on his arm, her touch grounding him. "We do this together," she said, her voice steady. With a nod, they moved as one, their combined strength and strategy their only hope against the monstrous foe. The clearing pulsed with an unnatural energy, the air thick with the oppressive weight of the Void Titan's presence. Its massive form loomed before them, a swirling mass of shadows and flame, its glowing red eyes fixed on the approaching group. The ground trembled beneath its bulk, and the jungle seemed to recoil in fear. Arya's grip on her blade tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, but she forced the fear down. This was their only chance to turn the tide. Beside her, Yarick stood tall, his golden eyes narrowed in fierce determination. His presence was a steadying force, grounding her in the face of the overwhelming threat. "Stay close," Yarick murmured, his voice a low growl that only she could hear. "We strike together." Arya nodded, her heart pounding. She signaled to the warriors flanking them, and they spread out, encircling the Void Titan. The plan was simple: distract and disorient the beast long enough for her and Yarick to strike at its core. It wasn't much, but it was all they had. The Void Titan let out a guttural roar, its form shifting and expanding as it sensed the threat. The air around it crackled with dark energy, and tendrils of shadow lashed out like living whips. One of the warriors leapt forward, drawing its attention with a fierce battle cry. The others followed suit, their coordinated attacks forcing the creature to divide its focus. Arya moved with precision, her blade flashing as she deflected a tendril that came too close. Yarick was a blur of motion beside her, his claws slicing through the shadowy limbs with brutal efficiency. They pushed forward, every step bringing them closer to the creature's core. "Now," Arya shouted, seizing an opening. She and Yarick charged together, their combined assault aimed at the Titan's vulnerable center. Her blade struck true, sinking into the creature's core with a blinding flash of light. At the same time, Yarick's claws tore through the surrounding shadows, disrupting its form. The Void Titan let out a deafening roar, its body convulsing as it struggled to maintain its shape. For a moment, Arya thought they had succeeded, but the victory was short-lived. The creature's eyes flared brighter, and a shockwave of dark energy erupted from its core, sending them both flying. Arya hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. She struggled to her feet, her vision swimming. Yarick was already up, his expression grim as he helped her stand. "It's not enough," he said, his voice tight. "We need to hit it again." Arya nodded, determination flaring anew. "Then let's finish this." Together, they pressed the attack, their movements synchronized in a deadly dance. The Void Titan's defenses were fierce, but they refused to back down. Every strike, every step brought them closer to their goal. As the battle raged on, Arya felt the weight of her exhaustion. Her muscles burned, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. But she pushed through the pain, drawing strength from Yarick's unwavering resolve. His presence was a constant, his fierce determination driving her forward. In a brief moment of respite, Yarick turned to her, his golden eyes blazing. "You're stronger than I ever imagined," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Arya met his gaze, her heart pounding for a different reason now. "I couldn't do this without you." The connection between them was palpable, a steady force that anchored them in the chaos. There was no time for words, only action. Together, they launched their final assault, their combined strength focused on the Void Titan's core. With a deafening roar, the creature began to unravel, its form collapsing in on itself. The ground shook violently, and the air was filled with the sound of its death throes. Arya and Yarick fought to stay on their feet, their eyes locked on the Titan as it disintegrated into nothingness. When the dust finally settled, the jungle was eerily quiet. The oppressive weight of the Void Titan's presence was gone, leaving only a sense of profound relief. The remaining warriors regrouped, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and triumph. "We did it," Arya said, her voice barely above a whisper. Yarick nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Because of you." Their moment of victory was interrupted by the distant sounds of battle. The void creatures still threatened the village, and their work was far from over. But for now, they had won an important battle, and the tide had begun to turn. Arya placed a hand on Jarek's arm, drawing strength from his steady presence. "Let's finish this," she said, her resolve unwavering. Jarek's lips curled into a faint, approving smile. Together. The jungle was alive with the sounds of retreating void creatures, their unnatural howls fading into the distance as the Tar warriors pushed forward. The battle at the village perimeter was still raging, but with the Void Titan destroyed, the creatures seemed disoriented, their coordinated attacks falling apart. Arya and Yarick led their group back through the dense jungle, moving swiftly but cautiously. The adrenaline from their victory over the Void Titan still coursed through Arya's veins, though exhaustion threatened to take hold. She glanced at Yarick, his expression focused but tense, his golden eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. When they finally reached the village, it was clear the battle had taken its toll. Several defensive walls had been breached, and the central square bore the marks of a fierce struggle. Fires burned in controlled pits, casting flickering light over the warriors who remained standing. Some tended to the wounded, their faces grim but resolute. Yarick immediately began issuing orders, his voice carrying authority. The warriors snapped to attention, moving to secure the remaining defenses and aid the injured. Despite their fatigue, they moved with purpose, bolstered by the knowledge that the worst of the fight was over. Arya took a moment to catch her breath, her gaze sweeping over the village. She spotted familiar faces among the wounded, their injuries a stark reminder of the cost of survival. Yet there was also a sense of hope, a quiet resilience that hadn't been there before. As she stood there, Yarick approached, his steps deliberate. He stopped beside her, his gaze following hers. "They fought well," he said, his voice low. "They've earned their rest." Arya nodded, her exhaustion evident, but her determination unwavering. "So have you." Yarick turned to her, his expression softening. For a moment, the weight of his responsibilities seemed to lift, and he reached out, his hand brushing lightly against her arm. The touch was brief but grounding, a silent acknowledgement of what they had accomplished together. "Come," he said after a moment. "There's something I need to show you." Arya followed him through the village, her curiosity piqued despite her fatigue. They climbed a narrow path that led to a high vantage point overlooking the settlement. The view was breathtaking, the jungle stretching out in every direction, its bioluminescent hues painting the night in soft blues and greens. Yarick stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "This land has always been our home," he said quietly, "but it's never felt as fragile as it does now." Arya understood the weight of his words. The Void Titan's attack had shaken the very foundation of their world, and though they had won this battle, the scars would remain. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch firm but gentle. "You've protected your people," she said, "and you'll continue to do so. You're stronger together." Yarick turned to her, his golden eyes searching hers. "Because of you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you've given us more than just a chance to survive. You've given us hope." The intensity of his gaze made her heart skip a beat. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the connection between them. Yarick reached up, his hand brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch lingered, the warmth of his fingers sending a shiver down her spine. Arya didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the moment, her own hand coming to rest lightly on his chest. She could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, a grounding presence in the aftermath of the battle. Without another word, Yarok leaned in, capturing her lips in a slow, deliberate kiss. It was a kiss filled with unspoken promises, a meeting of equals who had faced the darkest of battles together. Arya responded in kind, her fingers curling slightly against him as she let herself be drawn into the warmth of the moment. When they finally pulled apart, Yarok rested his forehead against hers, his breathing steady. "We still have much to do," he said softly. "But for now, this is enough." Arya nodded, her own breath catching as she held his gaze. "It is." They stayed there for a while longer, the quiet of the jungle wrapping around them like a protective cocoon. Eventually, they returned to the village, where the warriors had begun to regroup. Though the wounds of battle were fresh, the spirit of the tar remained unbroken. In the days that followed, Arya and Yeruk worked tirelessly to rebuild what had been lost. The village slowly came back to life, its people united in their shared purpose. Arya found herself becoming more deeply ingrained in their community, her role as both a warrior and a leader solidifying. Despite the challenges, there was a growing sense of hope. The bond between Arya and Yerk strengthened, their shared experiences forging a connection that went beyond words. Together, they faced each new obstacle with unwavering resolve, their partnership a testament to the strength that could be found in unity. But even as they rebuilt, Arya knew that the peace they had fought for was fragile. The void's influence might have been diminished, but its threat was far from eradicated. The fight was far from over, and Arya was determined to see it through to the end. She would stand by Jarek's side, no matter what came next. Together, they would protect this world and its people, forging a new path forward in the face of uncertainty. And in the quiet moments between battles, they would find solace in each other, a reminder of what they were fighting for. The days following the battle passed in a blur of reconstruction and quiet determination. The Tar village, though scarred, began to heal under the combined efforts of its people. Arya moved among them, offering her skills and guidance where needed. Her presence was no longer met with wary glances. Instead, the warriors and villagers alike acknowledged her with nods of respect, even gratitude. Yeruk was never far from her side. Together, they assessed the village's defenses, strategized for the future, and provided steady leadership in the face of uncertainty. The bond between them had deepened in ways that neither of them had anticipated. It was a quiet, unspoken understanding that grew stronger with every shared moment. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the jungle was bathed in the soft glow of its bioluminescent flora, Yeruk found Arya near the edge of the village. She was seated on a low stone, her blade resting across her knees, its edge glinting in the fading light. She appeared lost in thought, her gaze distant. Yeruk approached silently, his heavy steps deliberately softened on the jungle floor. When he was close enough, he lowered himself to sit beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet hum of the jungle filling the space between them. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Arya asked finally, her voice soft but steady. Yeruk considered her question, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "For my people, survival has always been enough," he said. "But now, I see that we can be more than that. We can rebuild, stronger than before." Arya turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "And for you?" Yeruk met her gaze, the golden light of his eyes reflecting a quiet intensity. "For me, the path is clearer than it's ever been," he said. "I'll protect my people. I'll fight for their future. And I'll stand with you, no matter what challenges come." There was a weight to his words that sent a warmth through Arya's chest. She reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his. Yeruk responded in kind, his larger hand enveloping hers. The contact was simple, yet it spoke volumes. "Together, then," Arya said softly. Jarek's lips curved into a faint smile. "Together." The peaceful moment was interrupted by the arrival of one of the elder warriors, his expression grim. Yeruk Arya, he said, his tone urgent. We've received word from the southern outpost. The Void's remnants are regrouping. They're gathering strength for another attack. Arya and Yeruk exchanged a glance, their moment of respite coming to an abrupt end. They both rose to their feet, their resolve unshaken. We'll prepare the warriors, Yeruk said, his voice firm. We'll meet this threat head on. The elder nodded and left to relay the orders. Arya turned back to Yeruk, her expression serious. This won't be like before, she said. The Void won't underestimate us again. We need to find a way to hit them where it hurts. Jarek's eyes narrowed in thought. Their core is vulnerable, but we don't have the means to strike it directly without risking everything. Arya's mind raced as she pieced together a plan. We don't have to strike the core itself, she said. If we can disrupt their energy source, we can weaken their forces significantly. Yeruk nodded, his expression resolute. Then that's what we'll do. They spent the next several hours devising a strategy. Arya used her knowledge of energy systems and tactics, while Yeruk provided invaluable insight into the Void's patterns and weaknesses. By the time dawn broke, they had a plan in place. The Tar warriors gathered in the central square, their faces grim but determined. Yeruk stood at the forefront, his presence commanding as he addressed them. We've faced the Void before, and we've prevailed, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd. But this battle will test us in ways we've never known. We fight not just for survival, but for the future of our people. Arya stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the gathered warriors. We have a plan, she said, and if we stand together, we will succeed. Trust in your strength, trust in each other, and we will see this through. The warriors let out a unified roar, their confidence bolstered by the words of their leaders. With that, the group set out, their path lit by the faint glow of the jungle's flora. The journey to the southern outpost was tense, every rustle of leaves and distant sound putting the warriors on edge. When they finally arrived, they found the outpost in ruins, the aftermath of a brutal attack. But it wasn't empty. The Void forces were there, regrouping as anticipated. Arya and Yeruk led the charge, their combined presence a rallying force for the warriors. The battle was fierce, the Void creatures fighting with a ferocity that matched the desperation of their dwindling numbers. But the Tar fought with renewed strength, their determination unyielding. Amid the chaos, Arya and Yeruk pressed forward, their target clear. They reached the Void's energy conduit, a pulsating structure that seemed to feed directly into their core. Arya worked quickly, using her knowledge of energy systems to disrupt its flow. All the while, Yeruk guarded her, his claws and teeth tearing through any creature that dared come close. The moment the conduit was destabilized, a surge of energy rippled through the battlefield. The Void creatures faltered, their forms flickering and weakening. The Tar seized the opportunity, pressing their advantage and driving the enemy back. When the battle finally ended, the warriors let out a victorious roar. The Void forces had been defeated, their remnants scattered and broken. Arya and Yeruk stood at the heart of the battlefield, their breathing heavy, but their spirits unbroken. We did it, Arya said, her voice filled with relief. Yeruk nodded, his gaze steady. This victory is ours, he said, but the fight is not over. We must remain vigilant. Arya placed a hand on his arm, her touch firm. And we will, she said, together. The Tar warriors moved through the ruins of the southern outpost, their victory bittersweet. The Void forces had been driven back, their energy conduit destroyed, but the cost was evident. The scorched earth and fallen warriors spoke of the toll the battle had taken. Despite the exhaustion etched into every face, there was a palpable sense of triumph in the air. They had struck a decisive blow against the Void, but all knew it was not the end. Arya stood at the edge of the battlefield, her gaze fixed on the horizon. The jungle, once vibrant and teeming with life, was now quiet, as if holding its breath. She could feel the weight of the fight ahead pressing down on her. This was a temporary victory, and the Void would regroup. Yeruk approached silently, his presence grounding her as it always did. He stopped beside her, his golden eyes scanning the same horizon. "They'll come back," he said, his voice a low rumble. Stronger. Desperate. Arya nodded, her grip tightening on the hilt of her blade. "We need to be ready." Yarok turned to face her fully, his expression serious, but softened by an undercurrent of concern. "There's something else," he said. "A core deeper in the jungle. The elder spoke of it before we left. If we strike there, we could end this." Arya met his gaze, her heart pounding. "How far?" "2 days' journey," Yarok replied, "through the densest part of the jungle." She could see the weight of his words in his eyes. It was a risk, a mission that could easily end in failure. But it was their best chance. "Then we leave at first light," she said firmly. That night, the village was quiet. The warriors rested in preparation for what was to come, their minds steeling for the battle ahead. Arya found herself unable to sleep, her thoughts racing as she considered the challenge before them. She had faced impossible odds before, but this felt different. The stakes were higher, the danger more tangible. She stepped outside her shelter, the cool night air a welcome relief. The jungle glowed softly around her, its bioluminescent flora casting an ethereal light. She walked toward the central fire, finding Yarok there, his broad frame silhouetted against the flickering flames. "You can't sleep either," she said, her voice breaking the quiet. Yarok glanced up, a faint smile touching his lips. "Too much on my mind." Arya sat beside him, the warmth of the fire a comfort against the cool night. "You've carried this burden for a long time," she said softly, "but you're not alone anymore." Jarek's gaze softened as he looked at her. "And I'm stronger for it," he admitted. "You've changed everything, Arya. For my people and for me." The intensity of his words made her heart ache in a way she hadn't expected. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "We'll see this through. Together." Jarek's fingers curled around hers, his touch warm and grounding. "Together," he echoed. For a moment, they simply sat there, the fire crackling softly between them. The weight of their shared responsibility was heavy, but so was the quiet strength they drew from each other. As the night deepened, the world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the connection between them. At dawn, they gathered a small team of the strongest warriors and set out. The journey through the jungle was grueling, the terrain becoming increasingly difficult as they ventured deeper. The air grew thick, the dense canopy above blocking out much of the light. Every sound seemed amplified, the distant calls of creatures blending with the rustle of leaves and the occasional crack of a branch underfoot. Despite the physical challenges, Arya and Yarok pressed on, their focus unwavering. The warriors moved with practiced efficiency, their senses heightened by the tension of the journey. Arya felt the weight of each step, but she drew strength from Jarek's steady presence beside her. On the second night, they camped in a small clearing, the jungle pressing in around them. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that danced on the surrounding trees. The warriors spoke in hushed tones, their exhaustion evident, but their resolve unshaken. Arya sat apart from the group, sharpening her blade with slow, deliberate movements. Yarok joined her, his expression thoughtful as he watched her work. "Tomorrow, we reach the core," he said quietly. Arya nodded, her eyes on the blade in her hands. "And we end this." Yarok was silent for a moment before he spoke again, his voice softer. "If we don't make it back, we will," Arya interrupted, her tone firm. She looked up, meeting his gaze. "We've come too far to stop now." Jarek's expression softened, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You never let me finish," he said, a note of warmth in his voice. Arya couldn't help but smile back. "Then stop being so dramatic." Yarok chuckled softly, the sound a brief respite from the weight of the moment. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a warmth through her that chased away the lingering chill of the jungle night. "We'll see this through," Yarok said, his voice low but steady. "And whatever comes after, we face it together." Arya's fingers tightened around his, her resolve strengthening. Together. As the fire burned low, they remained close, drawing strength from each other in the quiet of the night. The journey had tested them in ways they hadn't anticipated, but it had also forged an unbreakable bond. When dawn broke, the team set out once more, the dense jungle ahead a harbinger of the final battle to come. The core was close, its dark energy a palpable presence in the air. They moved with purpose, their goal clear. Whatever awaited them at the heart of the void's power, they would face it as one. The oppressive energy of the void core grew heavier with each step. The jungle, once alive with soft glows and distant calls, now seemed muted, its vibrant hues dulled under the weight of the dark force that pulsed at its center. Arya could feel it like a pressure in her chest, an unrelenting reminder of the battle ahead. She glanced at Yerrick, his golden eyes sharp and focused, his every movement filled with purpose. They crested a ridge and looked down into a massive clearing. At its center stood the void core, a towering, pulsating mass of darkness, its surface shifting and writhing as though alive. Tendrils of shadow snaked out from its base, burrowing into the ground and spreading through the jungle like roots. Around it, void creatures stood in eerie stillness, their red eyes fixed on the core as if awaiting orders. Yerrick spoke quietly, his voice tense. "It's stronger than I expected." Arya nodded, her mind racing as she assessed their position. "We'll need to draw their forces away from the core. If we can create enough of a distraction, I can get close and plant the charges." Jarek's jaw tightened, his claws flexing at his sides. "I won't let you face that alone." "You won't have to," Arya said, her gaze steady. "But you're the only one who can keep them off me long enough to finish the job." For a moment, Yerrick seemed ready to argue, but then he exhaled and nodded. "We'll do this together." They quickly relayed the plan to the warriors, who spread out along the ridge, ready to strike. With a signal from Yerrick, they launched their assault. The Tar warriors descended into the clearing with fierce battle cries, their movements swift and precise. The void creatures reacted instantly, surging toward the intruders in a chaotic swarm. Arya and Yerrick moved together, cutting through the enemy with practiced efficiency. Jarek's claws tore through the shadowy forms, his powerful strikes creating openings for Arya to advance. She fought with precision, her blade a blur as it cleaved through tendrils and creatures alike. The battle was intense, the air thick with the sounds of clashing weapons and the guttural roars of both tar and void. Yet despite the chaos, Arya and Yerrick pressed forward, inching closer to the core. Arya's heart pounded as they reached the edge of the clearing, the void core looming before them. "Now," she shouted over the din, pulling a small device from her belt. It was a compact explosive designed to disrupt energy fields, a tool she had salvaged and modified from her ship's wreckage. Yerrick nodded, his expression fierce. "I'll hold them." He surged forward, placing himself between Arya and the advancing void creatures. His roars echoed across the battlefield as he fought with relentless fury, every strike driving the enemy back. Arya worked quickly, her hands steady as she activated the device and set it at the core's base. The core's surface pulsed violently, sensing the threat. Tendrils lashed out toward her, but Arya dodged and weaved, her blades slicing through them as she secured the device. "Almost there," she muttered, her focus unshaken. Behind her, Yerrick let out a roar of pain. Arya whipped around to see him staggering, a deep gash across his side from one of the larger void creatures. Her breath caught, but Yerrick didn't falter. He struck back with renewed ferocity, driving the creature away even as blood stained his fur. "Yerrick," she called, but he only growled in response. "Finish it," he bellowed, his voice filled with both command and trust. Arya forced herself to focus. She completed the final sequence, the device emitting a high-pitched whine as it locked onto the core's energy signature. "It's set," she shouted, her voice carrying over the noise. "We need to move." Yerrick turned, his golden eyes meeting hers. With a final, powerful swipe, he pushed back the nearest void creatures and rushed to her side. Together, they sprinted toward the ridge, their movements synchronized despite their injuries. Behind them, the void core began to tremble, its dark surface cracking as the device did its work. The tendrils recoiled, and the creatures let out distorted howls, their forms flickering and dissolving. The energy in the air shifted, growing unstable. They reached the ridge just as the core erupted in a blinding explosion of light and shadow. The force of the blast sent a shockwave through the jungle, flattening trees and scattering debris. Arya and Yarok hit the ground, shielding their faces as the energy passed over them. When the light faded, the clearing was silent. The void core was gone, its presence erased entirely. The remaining void creatures had collapsed, their forms disintegrating into ash. The oppressive weight that had hung over the jungle was lifted, replaced by a calm, almost serene stillness. Arya sat up slowly, her body aching but intact. She turned to Yarok, who was already rising to his feet, his breathing heavy but steady. His wound bled freely, but he dismissed it with a shake of his head. "We did it," Arya said, her voice filled with both relief and exhaustion. Yarok nodded, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "Because of you." She managed a tired smile, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Because of us." The remaining warriors began to emerge from the jungle, their expressions a mix of awe and triumph. They gathered around Arya and Yarok, their leader's strength and unity serving as a beacon of hope. The battle was over, but the journey was not. Together, they would rebuild, forging a new future for the Tar and their world. And in the quiet moments between, Arya and Yarok would find solace in the bond they had forged, stronger than any force they had faced, and ready to withstand whatever came next.